The night began like any other late-night appearance, with the buzzing anticipation that Chris Stapleton's presence always brings to a television studio. The audience cheered as the country star walked onto the stage, his familiar rugged look drawing admiration from fans seated in the crowd. Jimmy Kimmel, ever the sharp and playful host, greeted him warmly with an extended handshake, but there was an undertone of tension already hanging in the air. Observers didn't catch it at first. The smile seemed genuine, the applause felt natural, and the banter began just as it always does on a late-night talk show. But behind Stapleton's composed demeanor, there was a flicker of unease, as if he had arrived carrying a burden or a guarded secret. Kimmel, known for occasionally poking fun at his guests, seemed eager to test the waters with light jokes that were not landing quite as smoothly as usual. The first round of conversation flowed easily enough, with Kimmel asking Stapleton about his upcoming tour and the inspiration behind his latest album. Chris answered politely, his gravelly voice carrying sincerity as he described the late nights of writing music and the memories of his childhood that fed into his songs. The audience clapped warmly after each answer, clearly invested in hearing the stories behind the man whose voice had touched so many hearts. Yet, Jimmy's quick wit pushed into more playful territory. He teased Chris about his beard, about the supposed secrecy behind his songwriting process, and about the long hours he seemed to keep away from the public eye. The laughter from the crowd came easily, but Stapleton's forced smile suggested a growing discomfort. It was subtle, noticeable only to those looking closely, but a line was being approached, and one that Chris might not allow to be crossed. As the segment progressed, the mood shifted almost imperceptibly. Jimmy pressed Stapleton about a rumor circulating online that hinted at creative disagreements within his band. The host framed it as a joke, delivered with a grin and a chuckle, but Chris's eyes told another story. He leaned back in his chair, arms folding across his chest, signaling defensiveness. The audience, sensing something unusual, quieted slightly, unsure whether they were witnessing part of the show's playful banter or a moment where the mask of entertainment was beginning to slip. Chris answered cautiously, saying that every musician has creative discussions, but he stopped short of laughing along. Kimmel, pushing further, asked if those disagreements had ever led to storming out of rehearsal, a phrase that drew a sharp reaction. Chris's smile vanished, replaced by a serious stare that turned the temperature in the room noticeably colder. The silence that followed was heavy, the kind that audiences rarely encountered during what is supposed to be a light-hearted late-night segment. Chris Stapleton, known for his calm and easygoing personality, leaned slightly toward the microphone and spoke with deliberate clarity. He explained that the creative process isn't always about disagreements but about pushing each other to be better musicians. His tone was firm, and there was no trace of laughter left. Jimmy, perhaps misjudging the seriousness of his guest's response, attempted to lighten the mood again by tossing in a quick quip about how storming out sounded like a good album title. The crowd chuckled nervously, but Chris didn't return the humor. His jaw tightened, and he glanced toward the side of the stage, as though questioning whether the conversation was one he wanted to continue. The tension built as Jimmy tried steering the conversation back toward safer ground, but by then, the mood had shifted too dramatically to reset. Chris, normally generous with his words, began giving shorter and sharper responses, his patience visibly thinning. The audience picked up on the unease, their laughter scattered and hesitant now. Stapleton's fans knew he valued authenticity above all else, and something about the host's line of questioning had struck a nerve that felt disrespectful. He adjusted his hat, a gesture that seemed to signal his desire to end the exchange, but Jimmy pushed once more, asking if Chris ever worried about being too serious for mainstream television. That question landed with a thud. Chris exhaled slowly, his voice deepening as he replied that his art wasn't made for television jokes, but for people who felt something real. By this point, the cameras caught an uncharacteristic glare in Stapleton's eyes. His tone was not hostile, but it was undeniably sharp, and the audience sat in stunned silence. The host, realizing he had provoked something genuine, hesitated before moving forward. Yet the damage had been done, and the interview had already veered off the usual polished path. Chris shifted in his seat, looked directly at Jimmy, and said words that drew an audible gasp from the crowd. "If you're not here to respect the music, then maybe I don't need to be here at all." The studio's atmosphere froze in an instant. This wasn't a scripted moment or a clever setup. It was raw, unscripted conflict unfolding live, and no one knew how it would end. Even the band members in the corner exchanged uneasy glances as they waited for what would happen next. Jimmy Kimmel, who had weathered plenty of awkward interviews throughout his career, tried to regain control of the moment with a half smile and a quick deflection. He joked about being the fun police and assured Chris that he meant no disrespect, but the damage was done. Stapleton's words had landed heavily, and the audience felt the shift. Chris leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and looked Jimmy dead in the eyes, as if challenging him to either continue down that road or back off entirely. For a second, the crowd believed they were watching a man who had reached the very edge of his patience. Then Chris pulled back, shaking his head slightly, muttering under his breath. Cameras didn't catch every word, but enough was heard to suggest he felt mocked rather than celebrated. It was becoming increasingly clear that this was not just banter gone wrong but a full collision of values or authentic artistry clashing with late-night comedy. In a final attempt to salvage the segment, Jimmy asked about Chris's family life, perhaps hoping that a warmer subject would soften the mood. Chris gave a brief but heartfelt mention of his wife and children, yet even then, there was no levity in his tone. He spoke earnestly about the importance of keeping his personal life away from public spectacle, a comment that indirectly pushed back against the very format of the show. The studio band, sensing unease, stayed quiet rather than adding their usual playful cues. Jimmy shifted uncomfortably in his chair, glancing at the audience as though searching for a lifeline. What had begun as an ordinary talk show appearance had now morphed into an unfiltered moment of defiance. The cheers and laughter that typically filled the studio were gone, replaced by an uncertain hush that only deepened the discomfort of everyone present. And then, almost as if he had decided he'd had enough, Chris straightened his jacket, removed his microphone clip, and placed it deliberately on the chair. The audience gasped, realizing what he was about to do. Jimmy tried to stop him, raising a hand and insisting that they could move on to a performance, but Chris shook his head. His gravelly voice carried across the stunned studio, "Music isn't a punchline. I came here to share songs, not to be ridiculed." With that, he rose from his seat and turned toward the wings of the stage. The studio erupted in chaos, half the audience clapping in confused support, the other half stunned into silence. Producers scrambled behind the cameras, unsure whether to cut to commercial or let the raw drama play out. For the first time in years, Jimmy Kimmel looked genuinely rattled, his attempts at humor completely abandoned. As Chris walked toward the side of the stage, the cameras tried to keep up with him, unsure whether to stay focused or cut away. Jimmy called out, his voice higher than usual, saying they could still perform a song, but Chris didn't turn back. The audience murmured, phones already slipping out of pockets as people realized they were witnessing a late-night moment destined to go viral. Chris's boots echoed across the stage floor, each step punctuating his decision to leave. The producers in the control room frantically signaled to switch to a wide shot, hoping to frame the scene in a way that didn't look catastrophic. But nothing could soften the reality. A celebrated country star was walking off in protest, live on national television. It wasn't staged. It wasn't scripted, it was raw defiance against a format he felt had crossed a line. Jimmy remained seated for a moment, clearly caught off guard, his usual quick comebacks absent. He tried to laugh it off, telling the audience, "Well, I guess that's one way to end an interview," but the words landed flat. Some audience members chuckled nervously, but most sat stunned, unsure how to react. The tension hung so thick it seemed to press down on everyone in the studio. Jimmy adjusted his tie, glanced toward the band, and then at the camera, as though silently asking for direction. Behind him, crew members scrambled, whispering urgently into headsets, debating whether to cut to a commercial or let Jimmy try to recover. For the first time in a long while, the polished world of late-night television had slipped, revealing how fragile the balance between humor and respect could be when a guest wasn't willing to play along. Meanwhile, backstage, Chris's team gathered around him, some urging him to reconsider and return, others respecting his decision to walk away. Chris pulled off his hat, running a hand through his hair, clearly frustrated but unshaken. "I'm not here to be anyone's punchline," he muttered, loud enough for nearby staff to hear. Word spread quickly among crew members, and even those not directly involved in the interview began whispering about what had just unfolded. To them, it felt historic, a genuine, unscripted clash that would dominate headlines by morning. Stapleton's reputation as a grounded, no-nonsense artist had been reinforced, but so too had his unwillingness to tolerate disrespect. Back in the studio, Jimmy attempted to transition to the next segment, but the awkwardness lingered. Viewers at home could feel it, the sense that something extraordinary had just happened, something that would replay endlessly across social media feeds. Outside the immediate studio bubble, news outlets were already beginning to stir. Social media lit up within minutes as clips from audience members' phones began circulating. Some users framed Chris Stapleton as a hero for standing his ground, while others criticized him for overreacting to what they perceived as harmless jokes. The divide was sharp, with hashtags about the incident trending within the hour. Meanwhile, the official broadcast went on, but the energy was gone. Even Jimmy's trademark charm couldn't mask the discomfort that had seeped into the show. At home, viewers sat glued to their screens, replaying the moment again and again, trying to decipher the exact second the mood shifted. To many, This wasn't just entertainment gone wrong, it was a cultural flashpoint that raised questions about the relationship between artists and late-night comedy. Back in his dressing room, Chris sat quietly, sipping water, his phone buzzing non-stop on the table beside him. His manager leaned in, telling him they could spin the story however they wanted, but Chris shook his head. "I don't need spin, I need respect," he said firmly. That phrase, overheard by someone in the hallway, was later repeated in countless online posts and articles as if it were a manifesto. Chris wasn't shouting, wasn't ranting, he was calm, almost weary, as though this had been building for some time. The clash with Jimmy was simply the spark that ignited what had long been smoldering beneath the surface. His refusal to play along with a joke he felt undercut his artistry was seen by fans as proof of his authenticity. To critics, it was evidence of a thin skin. Either way, the moment had cemented itself into pop culture history. As producers debated whether to invite Chris back on stage for a performance segment, his decision had already been made. He stood, gathered his things, and told his team he was leaving. Security cleared a path as he walked briskly through the backstage corridors, his hat back in place, his guitar case carried firmly at his side. Every staff member he passed seemed torn between offering a supportive nod and avoiding eye contact altogether. By the time he reached the exit, camera crews from outside outlets had already gathered, tipped off by whispers of a blow-up. Flashbulbs lit up the night as Chris stepped into the waiting SUV, his face serious but composed. He didn't answer questions, didn't acknowledge the shouts of reporters, he simply closed the door behind him. The engine roared to life, and within moments, he was gone. Back inside the studio, Jimmy tried to regain his footing with the audience. He leaned on his signature self-deprecating humor, making jokes at his own expense about how he had finally scared off a guest. A ripple of uneasy laughter passed through the crowd, but it lacked the genuine energy his monologues usually commanded. The band played a light riff to fill the silence, but the air felt heavy, as though everyone knew they had just been part of something that would overshadow the entire episode. Jimmy shifted quickly into the next segment, interviewing another guest, but his rhythm was off. Even the home viewers sensed the awkwardness, flooding social media with comments about how shaken the usually unflappable host had seemed. For once, the script had failed, and reality had taken control. By the time the show ended, clips of Stapleton walking off had already reached millions of people online. Fan forums buzzed with speculation. Was this a publicity stunt, or was it real anger? Those who knew Chris's history leaned toward the latter, pointing out that he had never been one to chase headlines or drama. In fact, many argued, the very reason his music resonated with so many was because he seemed immune to the artificiality of the spotlight. The contrast between his authenticity and the glossy surface of late-night television only made the clash sharper. Some praised Jimmy for doing his job as a comedian, while others blasted him for crossing a line with an artist who took his work seriously. The cultural debate had officially begun, and both names trended side by side across every platform. Meanwhile, Chris's inner circle huddled together to decide their next move. Some argued he should issue a statement immediately to control the narrative, while others believed his silence would speak louder. Chris, however, appeared unfazed. He reminded them that his career wasn't built on television appearances but on the strength of his music. "People will believe what they want," he said simply, strumming a few chords on his guitar as though to remind himself of what really mattered. His team respected his calm but knew the press frenzy would be relentless. Already, major outlets were requesting interviews, hoping to get his side of the story. Chris wasn't ready to talk, not yet. For now, he preferred to let the dust settle while the world debated what his walkout really meant. Outside the studio, fans were split between admiration and confusion. Some gathered near the stage door, hoping to catch a glimpse of Chris before he left, while others lingered in disbelief that the evening had unraveled so quickly. A few lucky bystanders managed to record the moment Chris exited the building, his guitar case swinging by his side as security shielded him from the cameras. Those clips soon joined the flood online, racking up hundreds of thousands of views within hours. For many fans, seeing their hero walk away without saying a word became a symbol of quiet rebellion. To them, Chris had stood against the spectacle, refusing to be turned into late-night comedy fodder. To others, it looked like stubbornness, the kind of reaction that might close doors in the future. Either way, the night had left a mark impossible to erase. Back at home, viewers who hadn't seen the live broadcast scrolled through endless replays, dissecting every glance, every pause, every word exchanged between Chris and Jimmy. Analysts speculated on talk radio about whether Kimmel had intentionally pushed too hard, while entertainment blogs churned out headlines that exaggerated the drama even further. Words like meltdown, feud, and walkout dominated coverage, even though the reality was more subdued. Chris hadn't shouted or cursed, he had simply chosen to leave. Yet in the language of television, Silence and restraint can sometimes feel louder than confrontation. The simplicity of his exit added to its power, making the story grow larger than life in the public imagination. Soon, celebrities from other industries began weighing in, some supporting Stapleton's stand, others defending Kimmel's comedic freedom. Inside Chris's camp, the debate raged on about how to handle the fallout. His publicist suggested releasing a carefully worded statement to clarify his intentions, emphasizing respect for the show while reaffirming his commitment to authenticity. His wife, however, advised against it, reminding him that the very act of walking away had already spoken volumes. Chris leaned toward her perspective, believing that actions mattered more than press releases. Meanwhile, record label executives worried about how the story might impact promotional plans for his upcoming tour. Some feared networks would hesitate to book him for appearances, while others believed the controversy might fuel even greater demand. Chris remained calm, strumming absent-mindedly on his guitar, his mind already drifting back to the music. To him, the walkout wasn't a scandal, it was a line in the sand that he refused to let anyone cross. The following morning, the media storm intensified. Major networks replayed the clip on loop, with pundits offering wildly different takes. Some described Stapleton's departure as a bold statement about the commodification of artistry, while others painted it as an overblown reaction to harmless late-night banter. Talk shows debated whether Jimmy Kimmel had crossed a line, or if Chris had simply misunderstood the humor. Meanwhile, fans on social media produced endless memes, GIFs, and remixes of the walkout moment, amplifying its visibility. The event became less about what had actually been said and more about what it represented, a collision between the authenticity of a musician devoted to his craft and the often superficial nature of entertainment television. The narrative took on a life of its own, stretching far beyond what either Chris or Jimmy might have expected. Jimmy's team moved quickly to manage the fallout from their side. A statement was drafted emphasizing that Chris was welcome back anytime and that the host had nothing but admiration for his music. Jimmy himself cracked jokes about the incident during his opening monologue the next night, presenting it as part of the unpredictable nature of live television. But careful listeners could detect a faint edge of unease in his delivery, as though he knew the moment had spiraled beyond his control. The jokes helped soften the blow with some viewers, yet others accused him of downplaying the seriousness of the clash. Online, fans dissected every word of his monologue, debating whether he was sincere or just performing damage control. Either way, the story refused to fade, continuing to dominate headlines well into the week. Chris, on the other hand, stayed quiet. His silence only fueled speculation, with journalists clamoring for any comment, but he remained focused on rehearsals for his upcoming shows. Those close to him said he wasn't interested in stoking the fire. To him, the matter was simple: he had been disrespected, and he had removed himself from the situation. That was all. Yet his refusal to engage made the public conversation louder, as though the absence of his voice left a void that fans and critics alike felt compelled to fill. For every article criticizing him as humorless, there were two praising him for sticking to his principles. In a media landscape obsessed with sound bites, Chris's decision to say nothing became the most powerful statement of all. His walkout was now etched into late-night television lore, regardless of how he felt about it. As days passed, the incident began evolving from a scandal into a cultural talking point. Music critics wrote essays about the tension between authenticity and entertainment, noting that Stapleton had unintentionally sparked a broader debate. Was late-night television a platform for genuine artistry, or merely a stage for comedy wrapped around promotion? Stapleton's walkout became a symbol for musicians who felt their craft was often trivialized by the mainstream media machine. Meanwhile, comedians defended Jimmy Kimmel, arguing that humor had always been a way to engage artists and audiences alike. This clash of perspectives fueled panel discussions on radio and podcasts, ensuring that what had begun as a 15-minute interview now resonated as a larger reflection of how fame and creativity collide in the public eye. In Nashville, the response was overwhelmingly in Chris's favor. Fellow country artists and songwriters praised him privately and publicly, calling his actions brave and true to the values of the genre. Country music, after all, had always been rooted in honesty and emotion, and Stapleton's refusal to play along with jokes he found disrespectful struck many as consistent with those values. A few even suggested that his walkout could strengthen his legacy, positioning him not just as a talented musician but as a defender of artistic integrity. Industry insiders noted that ticket sales for his tour spiked noticeably in the days after the incident, proving that controversy could sometimes draw fans even closer. What critics saw as stubbornness, fans saw as loyalty to the music that mattered most. Jimmy, meanwhile, struggled with the fallout in ways that weren't always visible on screen. Though he carried on with his usual blend of comedy and charm, Insiders revealed he had been rattled by the confrontation. He wasn't accustomed to guests walking out, especially not artists with reputations as respected as Chris Stapleton's. The incident forced him and his team to reconsider their approach, particularly when dealing with musicians who placed a high value on their craft. Though Jimmy insisted publicly that there were no hard feelings, sources close to the show admitted that he replayed the interview multiple times afterward, trying to pinpoint exactly where the exchange had gone wrong. For a host who thrived on laughter, silence had been the most unsettling reaction of all. Meanwhile, Chris continued to focus on his music, treating the incident as a minor distraction rather than a defining moment. He returned to the studio to record new tracks, the energy from the controversy subtly influencing his songwriting. Some tracks contain more introspective themes, reflecting on respect, authenticity, and the pressures of public life. Fans listening closely speculated that the Walkout had inspired certain lyrics, adding a layer of personal significance to the music. While the media attempted to link every move he made to the television incident, Chris remained consistent in his approach: work hard, stay true to his art, and let the music speak for itself. In the end, it was clear he viewed the clash not as a scandal, but as a reminder of the values he refused to compromise. Social media continued to buzz, with each side debating the significance of the Walkout. Memes proliferated, some humorously portraying Chris as a music vigilante defending the sanctity of artistry, while others mocked the situation as overblown. Entertainment journalists wrote think pieces, dissecting the event frame by frame, searching for hints of tension in every gesture. In many ways, the incident had become a modern legend, an unscripted moment that blurred the line between reality and performance. Even those who hadn't watched the episode live knew the gist of what had happened, highlighting how quickly media events could be amplified in the digital age. Chris Stapleton, who rarely sought the spotlight, had inadvertently become the center of a conversation far larger than any late-night stage could contain. As the dust began to settle, both Chris and Jimmy found themselves reflecting on the incident privately. For Chris, it was a reminder of the importance of maintaining boundaries, even under the pressure of a national broadcast. For Jimmy, it was an unusual lesson in the unpredictability of live television and the fine line between humor and offense. Both parties publicly framed the incident as a misunderstanding, yet the underlying tension remained the talking point for fans and media alike. Over time, it became a reference point in discussions about how artists and entertainers navigate public appearances, the ethics of late-night comedy, and the respect owed to creative professionals. The episode had transcended its 15-minute runtime, becoming a cultural moment that would be remembered for years.